The explosion was deafening. Metal fragments tore through the left wing as Flight 847's engine disintegrated at 30,000 feet. Emergency alarms screamed in the cockpit, warning lights flashed red, and the massive Boeing 737 began shaking like a leaf in a hurricane. Captain Stevens's hands moved across the controls with practiced precision, but this wasn't standard emergency training kicking in. This was something deeper, the kind of crisis management you only learn when you're responsible for the safety of the most powerful person in the world. Welcome to Veteran Stories. Before we dive into this incredible tale of hidden expertise, life or death decisions, and the moment when a secret past becomes everyone's salvation, tell me in the comments which city you're watching from today. And if you believe stories of quiet heroes deserve to be told, hit that subscribe button. Sometimes the person saving your life is someone whose real story you'll never know. Delta Flight 847 departed Denver International Airport at 2:47 p.m., bound for Chicago O'Hare. It was a Tuesday afternoon, the kind of routine domestic flight that Captain Michael "Mike" Stevens had flown thousands of times over the past 8 years. At 52 years old, Mike was exactly what passengers expected from an airline captain: calm, professional, with the kind of steady voice that made nervous flyers relax during turbulence announcements. He joined Delta in 2015 after what his official biography listed as previous military service, though he never elaborated on the details. His co-pilot, First Officer Jennifer Walsh, was 15 years younger with excellent technical skills but limited experience in real emergencies. She respected Mike's calm demeanor and had learned more from flying with him than from any training manual. The flight carried 247 passengers, business travelers, families heading home, college students returning to school. Among them was Sarah Martinez with her twin 8-year-old daughters, retired teacher Robert Chen traveling to visit grandchildren, and Air Force Lieutenant Colonel David Parks, traveling in civilian clothes on his way to a Pentagon briefing. None of them knew that their captain had once held the call sign Eagle 1, the pilot designation for whoever was flying the President of the United States. At exactly 3:23 p.m., cruising at 30,000 feet over the Colorado Rockies, Flight 847's left engine exploded. The sound was like thunder trapped inside a metal tube. Passengers screamed as the aircraft lurched violently to the left, then began an uncontrolled yaw as the destroyed engine created massive drag. Oxygen masks dropped from the ceiling as the cabin pressure alarm shrieked. In the cockpit, Mike's training took over immediately. But this wasn't the standard commercial aviation emergency response drilled into every airline pilot. His hands moved across the controls with a precision and speed that came from years of flying the most critical aircraft in the world, where there was no margin for error, no backup plane, and failure meant national catastrophe. "Jennifer, declare Mayday," Mike ordered, his voice steady despite the chaos. "Tell ATC we've lost the left engine and need immediate vectors to the nearest suitable airport." Walsh fumbled with the radio, her hands shaking as she watched Mike work. She'd never seen anyone maintain such complete control during a catastrophic failure. "Denver Center, Delta 847, Mayday, Mayday, Mayday. We've suffered catastrophic engine failure at flight level 300 and need immediate assistance." The aircraft was losing altitude rapidly, and Mike faced a terrible choice. The nearest major airport was Denver, 200 miles behind them. Colorado Springs was closer but had a shorter runway, and directly below them was nothing but mountains, the kind of terrain that had claimed aircraft and lives when pilots made desperate attempts at emergency landings. Mike's mind processed the options with computer-like precision. Fuel remaining, approximately 3,400 pounds. Rate of descent, 1,200 feet per minute. Wind conditions, 15 knots from the southwest. Passenger load, maximum capacity. Weather, clear but with mountain turbulence likely. These weren't calculations from airline emergency procedures. This was the kind of split-second analysis he'd performed 3 times as the pilot of Air Force One when mechanical failures had threatened the president's life. "Jennifer, I need you to calculate our glide ratio to Colorado Springs," Mike said, already knowing the answer but wanting to keep his co-pilot focused and functional. "Captain, I don't think we can make it. The altitude loss is too rapid." Mike didn't respond immediately. He was remembering a flight in 2009 when Air Force One had suffered a similar hydraulic failure over the Pacific Ocean with President Obama aboard. The Secret Service had been ready to order an emergency bailout to the escort fighter jets, but Mike had managed a textbook emergency landing at Anchorage. The skills were identical, the stakes were just as high. The only difference was that instead of protecting the president, he was now protecting 247 strangers. In Seat 12A, Lieutenant Colonel David Parks was watching the cockpit door and listening to the engine noise with the trained ear of someone who understood aircraft systems. What he was hearing didn't match what he was feeling from the plane's movements. The pilot was doing something extraordinary, maintaining control authority despite the complete loss of the left power plant and managing the aircraft's energy state with precision that went beyond standard commercial training. This was military-level crisis management. Parks unbuckled his seatbelt and moved toward the cockpit, using his Pentagon ID to convince the flight attendant to let him through. He knocked on the cockpit door with the specific pattern that military aircrew use to identify themselves. Mike opened the door and immediately recognized Parks's bearing. Active duty officer, probably Air Force based on his haircut and posture. "Colonel Parks, Pentagon staff," Parks introduced himself quietly. "Captain, I need to ask, what's your military background?" Mike glanced at him while continuing to fly the crippled aircraft. "Need to know basis only, Colonel." Parks understood. But what he was witnessing confirmed his suspicions. This wasn't standard airline emergency procedures. This was something much more advanced. Mike made his decision. Colorado Springs was possible, but barely. He would have to execute what aviators call a dead stick approach, flying the heavy aircraft like a glider, with no power to correct mistakes, managing energy precisely to arrive at the runway with exactly the right speed and altitude. He'd done this twice before. Once with Air Force One in 2011 when a bird strike had damaged both engines during takeoff from Andrews Air Force Base. Once in 2013 when a hydraulic failure had left him with limited control authority while carrying the president back from an emergency NATO summit. Both times, the landings had been classified. No media coverage, no public recognition. Just successful crisis management that allowed the most powerful person in the world to continue his duties without interruption. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain," Mike announced over the intercom, his voice carrying the kind of calm authority that made people believe everything would be okay. "We've experienced a mechanical issue and will be making an unscheduled landing in Colorado Springs. Flight attendants, please prepare the cabin for emergency landing procedures." What he didn't say was that he had one chance to get this right. The aircraft was too heavy, the approach angle was steeper than optimal, and any mistake would turn the emergency landing into a catastrophic crash. Mike began his descent toward Colorado Springs Airport, calculating glide paths and energy management with the precision of a mathematician and the intuition of someone who'd done this before, under even greater pressure. First Officer Walsh watched in amazement as Mike configured the aircraft perfectly, extending flaps and landing gear at precisely the right moments to maximize lift while controlling descent rate. His hands never hesitated, never second-guessed. "Jennifer, I need you to contact the tower and tell them to have all emergency equipment standing by. Full response, fire, medical, everything." "Yes, Captain." "Mike, how are you doing this?" Mike smiled grimly, focused entirely on the task ahead. "Experience." In the cabin, passengers gripped their armrests and prayed. Sarah Martinez held her daughters close, whispering that everything would be okay. Robert Chen, the retired teacher, closed his eyes and tried to remember the emergency position from the safety demonstration. Colonel Parks remained in the cockpit, watching Mike work. What he was witnessing was artistry and crisis management, the kind of skill that couldn't be taught in simulators or learned from textbooks. At 800 feet above ground level, Mike could see the Colorado Springs runway ahead. The aircraft was exactly where it needed to be. Not too high, not too low, lined up perfectly despite the asymmetric thrust from the destroyed engine. At 500 feet, he made final adjustments to the approach path. The ground was rushing up fast, but the aircraft was stable and under control. At 200 feet, he prepared for touchdown. This was the moment when his Air Force One experience mattered most, the precision required to land a heavy aircraft with no margin for error. The main landing gear touched the runway with barely a bump. Mike immediately deployed the thrust reversers on the right engine and applied maximum braking, using every technique he'd learned from years of flying the president into airports that weren't always ideal for large aircraft. The Boeing 737 rolled to a stop 1,000 feet before the end of the runway. Perfect energy management, perfect execution. A landing that would have been challenging for any pilot became routine through the application of skills learned in the world's most demanding cockpit. Emergency vehicles surrounded the aircraft within seconds, but they weren't needed. Every passenger and crew member was safe. As passengers evacuated down the emergency slides, Mike remained in the cockpit, completing the shutdown checklist with the methodical precision that had defined his entire career. First Officer Walsh stared at him with a mixture of admiration and confusion. "Mike, I've been flying for 12 years. I've never seen anyone handle an emergency like that. Where did you really learn to fly?" Before Mike could answer, Colonel Parks knocked on the cockpit doorframe. "Captain Stevens, a word?" Mike nodded and stepped into the empty cabin with Parks. They were alone except for the final crew members securing the aircraft. "I know who you are," Parks said quietly. "Eagle 1, 2008 to 2014. Air Force One, pilot for Presidents Bush and Obama." Mike didn't deny it. There was no point. His flying had spoken for itself. "Why commercial aviation?" Parks asked. "You could have had any command in the Air Force." Mike looked out the window at the emergency vehicles and the passengers being checked by medical personnel. All safe, all alive. "Because this matters too," Mike said simply. "These people deserve the same level of safety as the president." Within hours, the emergency landing of Flight 847 was national news. The NTSB launched a full investigation into both the engine failure and the exceptional piloting skills that had prevented a catastrophe. Delta Airlines' chief pilot reviewed the cockpit voice recorder and flight data recorder with growing amazement. The precision of Mike's energy management, the accuracy of his glide path calculations, and the perfection of his landing approach were beyond what should have been possible for a commercial pilot dealing with such a severe emergency. Meanwhile, Colonel Parks made some discreet inquiries through his Pentagon contacts. What he learned confirmed his suspicions. Captain Michael Stevens had been one of the most highly regarded presidential pilots in Air Force history, with multiple classified emergency landings that had never been made public. The reason for his transition to commercial aviation was also classified, but Parks could read between the lines. After 6 years of flying the president, Mike had probably wanted a normal life, a regular schedule, and the ability to serve the public without the intense security requirements of presidential duty. The media coverage focused on the miracle landing and the heroic pilot, but Mike refused all interviews. Delta Airlines wanted to use him for publicity, but Mike requested that his military background remain private. However, word spread through aviation circles. Other pilots began reaching out, wanting to learn from someone who had demonstrated such extraordinary skill under pressure. Flight training schools asked him to develop emergency procedures courses. Mike declined most requests, but he did agree to work with the Air Force Academy as a guest instructor, teaching crisis management and emergency procedures to future military aviators. Sarah Martinez tracked down Mike's contact information and wrote him a letter that he kept on his desk at home. "Captain Stevens, my daughters and I were on Flight 847. I wanted you to know that because of your skill and calmness, my girls got to celebrate their 9th birthday last month. Whatever you did in your previous career, wherever you learned to fly like that, thank you for bringing those skills to protect people like us." Robert Chen, the retired teacher, sent a similar note. "In 50 years of education, I learned to recognize true expertise when I see it. What you did that day was the result of years of training and experience that most people will never understand. Thank you for using your gifts to keep us safe." Even passengers who hadn't known they were in danger wrote to thank him for the smooth, professional way he'd handled the emergency. 3 weeks later, after completing all required retraining and psychological evaluations following the emergency, Mike was back in the cockpit, flying routine commercial routes. His first flight back was Denver to Phoenix, another Boeing 737, another cabin full of passengers who had no idea that their pilot had once been responsible for the safety of the most powerful person in the world. First Officer Walsh was scheduled to fly with him again. Before departure, she approached him in the crew room. "Mike, I've been thinking about what happened. I've never asked you this directly, but were you really Air Force One pilot?" Mike looked at her with those calm eyes that had reassured passengers during the emergency landing. "Jennifer, what matters is that we get these people safely to their destination. That's our job, whether we're flying the president or a family going to visit grandparents." She nodded, understanding that some questions didn't need direct answers. Mike quietly began developing advanced emergency procedures, training for commercial pilots, drawing on techniques and decision-making processes that had been developed for presidential aviation, but had never been shared with civilian aviation. He worked with flight training organizations to create scenarios that pushed pilots beyond standard emergency procedures, teaching them the kind of crisis management skills that could mean the difference between a successful emergency landing and a catastrophe. His courses became legendary among professional pilots. They were never advertised publicly, but word spread through the aviation community. If you wanted to learn how to handle the impossible emergency, you learned from Captain Mike Stevens. Mike continued flying commercial routes for Delta, maintaining the same professional standards that had once protected the president. Passengers might notice that their captain seemed unusually calm and competent, but they would never know the full extent of his qualifications. He flew families to reunions, business travelers to important meetings, students to new opportunities. Each flight was treated with the same level of precision and care that he'd once brought to Air Force One missions. Other pilots began seeking him out as a mentor, drawn by his reputation for exceptional skill and judgment. Mike worked with them quietly, passing on lessons learned from the most demanding flying assignments in the world. Years later, when government classification periods expired, some details of Mike's Air Force One service became public. Aviation historians documented his role in several emergency situations that had been kept classified for national security reasons. The public learned that their commercial pilot hero had actually saved the president's life on multiple occasions using the same skills he'd displayed during Flight 847's emergency landing. But Mike never sought recognition for those earlier achievements. He understood that the highest form of service was protecting people regardless of who they were, and that true professionals did their jobs without needing public acknowledgement. Captain Michael Stevens continued to fly commercial aircraft until his retirement, treating every flight as if it carried the most important passengers in the world. Because to him, they did. Some heroes wear uniforms and receive medals. Others carry classified clearances and protect world leaders. And some take their extraordinary skills and use them to keep ordinary people safe during routine flights that suddenly become anything but routine. Flight 847's emergency landing lasted only 12 minutes, but it demonstrated a truth that extends far beyond aviation. The person sitting next to you, serving your coffee, or ensuring your safety might possess skills and experience that could save your life. And you'll never know their real story. The next time you're on an aircraft and the captain makes a smooth landing or handles turbulence with exceptional skill, remember that you might be in the hands of someone whose previous job was protecting the most powerful person in the world. Have you ever encountered someone whose calm competence in a crisis made you wonder about their background? Someone whose skills seemed to go far beyond what their current job required? Share their story in the comments. Tell us about the hidden professionals who've made your life safer without ever seeking credit. Because at Veteran Stories, we believe that the greatest heroes are often the ones whose most important work will always remain classified, whose greatest achievements will never be publicized, and whose service to others continues long after their official duties end. Subscribe if you want more stories about the quiet professionals among us, the ones who use world-class skills to protect ordinary people, who bring presidential-level competence to everyday situations, and who prove that true service never really ends. It just changes form.